Top 10 Smartphones Under 10,000 Rupees in India 2017 by Tech5Media. Today I am going to show 10 smartphones that you might not be aware of. So let's get started with our today's episode. There are just way too many phones around 10,000 rupees, so it's nothing less of a daunting task to pick the best one. We've compiled a list of 10 best smartphones under 10,000 rupees for this March month, so your task becomes easier. These include only 4G models since it doesn't make sense getting an only 3G phone anymore. To make things clear, phones with hybrid SIM slot allow you to either place a second SIM or a microSD card, but not both at the same time. So, it can be considered a disadvantage. So here are the 10 best 4G smartphones in India. Moto G4 Play, 5-inch IPS display, 2GB RAM, 16GB storage ROM, 8-megapixel camera and secondary camera 5-megapixel, octa-core 1.2 GHz Snapdragon 410, Android operating system 6.0 Marshmallow. With dual SIM 3G and 4G. Lecola 1S Eco, 5.5-inch IPS display, 3GB RAM, 32GB storage ROM, 13-megapixel camera and secondary camera 5-megapixel with sensor, Android operating system 5.1 Marshmallow, with dual SIM, 4G. Panasonic Aluga Note, 5.5-inch IPS display, 3GB RAM, 32GB storage ROM, 13-megapixel camera and secondary camera 5-megapixel, Android operating system 6.0 Marshmallow. Xiaomi Redmi 3S Prime, 5-inch IPS display, 3GB RAM, 32GB storage ROM, 13-megapixel camera and secondary camera 5-megapixel, octa-core Snapdragon 430, 1.4 GHz, Android operating system 6.0 Marshmallow. Moto E3 Power, 5-inch display, 2GB RAM, 16GB storage ROM, 8-megapixel camera and secondary camera 5-megapixel, quad-core 1 GHz, Cortex A53, Android operating system 6.0 Marshmallow. Xiaomi Redmi Note 4, 5.5-inch display, 2GB and 3GB RAM, 16GB and 32GB storage ROM, 13-megapixel camera and secondary camera 5-megapixel, with Android OS 6.0 Marshmallow. Lenovo Vibe K5 Note, 5-inch IPS display, 2GB and 3GB RAM, 16GB storage ROM, 13-megapixel camera and secondary camera 5-megapixel, with Android OS 6.0 Marshmallow, with dual SIM, 4G. Acer Z630S, 5.5-inch display, 3GB RAM, 32GB storage ROM, 8-megapixel camera and secondary camera 8-megapixel, Android operating system 5.1 Marshmallow. Asus Zenfone Max, 5.5-inch IPS display, 2GB and 3GB RAM, 32GB storage ROM, 13-megapixel camera and secondary camera 5-megapixel, octa-core Snapdragon 615, 1.7 GHz, Android operating system 6.0 Marshmallow. Lenovo K6 Power, 5-inch IPS display, 3GB RAM, 32GB storage ROM, 13-megapixel camera and secondary camera 8-megapixel, with Android OS 6.0 Marshmallow.